I can say honestly, if I was 40 years younger, I would think of moving out of Europe.
Ukraine is such an undemocratic state that it's been able to use undemocratic means to make that happen.
Well, I would see some hope in the possibility that the Trump regime, and I call it a regime, will go so bizarre and will therefore force delinking in Europe.
If we accept the analysis, then Europe is currently at one of its most irrational places in decades, if not centuries, of not being able to reconcile intellectually of the power distribution and the political distribution with what should happen. If we just accept that this is the case for Europe, and it probably will remain for at least years, then what would be your recommendation to how the others should treat Europe? Russia, China, maybe African states and other Asian states. I mean, how should they? What would be a signaling process that would help the Europeans to get over this moment as fast as possible? Do you have any ideas?
I don't think there is one. To be honest, I think Europe is set on the track of ever closer union, ever greater centralization. I think whatever moves like Russia makes, China makes, I mean, the answer is economic, social, and cultural. But actually, that requires Europeans to be susceptible and amenable to that kind of level of engagement, and they're not. And they're not because actually they're accreting ever greater powers in terms of kind of the unelected bodies in Europe. So I don't think actually it's possible, right now, without a more radical kind of rethink of the European project that actually steps back to the more intergovernmental kind of nature of it, that focuses on the economic, social, and cultural, and ditches all the kind of political and military kind of baggage. And maybe the accession of Ukraine at some indeterminate point in the future will help them to do that, because Europe simply can't afford to allow Ukraine to join on current terms anyway. But I think there needs to be a more fundamental I think Europe could be much better than it is, which frankly is not very good right now, but it needs a more structural reform, because until then it's just not really susceptible or amenable to any engagement from China, Russia, or frankly anybody else.
Well, I would see some hope in the possibility that the Trump regime, and I call it a regime, will go so bizarre and continue down the path they've chosen the first 3 months, and will therefore force delinking in Europe. It's obvious that the Americans could now use technology and codes, etc., to put a brake on the use of F-35s and things like that if they want to. I suppose that Trump is going to take Greenland. And I suppose he will go for this autarkic US from Panama up over Canada, etc. In one way or another, everything is for him is about resources, to create a self-reliant, by stealing others' resources, a self-reliant US. Now, if that becomes so impossible to accept for the Europeans that they will begin to think not with American brains, listening to his master's voice as they've done for the last 50 years, there might be some kind of push. God, we've got to do something else than what we've done so far. And that could, in the best of cases, leading to opening up again to Russia, to China, to the rest of the world, to the non-West, because they will find out by the shock therapy that you cannot have anything to do with the United States anymore. I would say total embargo, isolation, whatever, suspension of memberships of organization. This regime of Mr. Trump is going to be so bizarre and so destructive, both to the United States, which I say with pain in my heart, and to Europe and large parts of the world. But the Chinese are going to take it as an opportunity to do what they've always done, because they have two economies and they can live without the West. The West cannot live without them. And all. I mean, that's a long story. But the bizarreness of the Trump regime could be a catalyst for Europeans beginning to think we better reorient ourselves to a larger world and not to the US anymore. And that would perhaps, I was a religious, I would pray for it. that could be an opening towards a better future, because we've been so terribly arrogant in Europe that we did not need to cooperate with anybody, blah, blah, blah. Now we have to cooperate with anybody else but the United States.
And now we're getting to a situation, particularly as Russia started its move to autarky kind of over 10 years ago when the Ukraine crisis started. The US is making a very similar move. It's interesting. Sort of right now, Europe is the big power center in the world that has no resources of its own. I mean, obviously Norway has kind of considerable resources, so we can't be part of that kind of shift unless we have a better relationship with Russia that nobody wants. So that's the kind of conundrum we're in right now.
You could also see a catalyst in let them go for this crazy militarization, waste all the money and go bankrupt. And then somebody will have to say, well, militarization was not a good idea. We start all over again. But, you know, it's very sad that we can't get to that conclusion intellectually in time, but we may have to have a total economic catastrophe in Europe before we begin to think.
But what I'm worried about is that total economic catastrophe and, you know, mass impoverishment is actually part of militarization, because you need the poor to go to the front, right? I mean, if you want to fight a big war, like a trench warfare, just a bigger version of what we've seen in Ukraine, you need massive numbers of poor people who have only the gun to actually then nourish their families, right? So in a very sick sense, the impoverishment of Europe is actually going to further drive this war mentality that I'm seeing.
Yeah. But that mass mobilization has only been possible in Ukraine because Ukraine is such an undemocratic state that it's been able to use undemocratic means to make that happen. Now, the question is, could you do that in France? Could you kind of forcibly bussify French citizens to go to the front? No. Could you do it in Britain? Absolutely not, because one of the good things about our nations, amongst many faults, is that we are democracies. So the ability of European nations to kind of mobilize in the same way, I think, is not, frankly, the same as has been the case in Ukraine.
It might also be, Pascal, that you will see labor unions and others saying we're refusing that role that you point to. I mean, earlier, if you take the 80s, the labor unions were more, and people, intellectuals around that, Marxists and people like historian E.P. Thompson and people like Rudy Barrow in Eastern Germany at the time, they were intellectuals who could think beyond these, but they were also people who thought of the masses and the workers and the potential for people rising at the time. And so what I think is now going to happen is what I predicted more than 40 years ago, not to boast about it, but that was pretty predictable for me, was when the Eastern West had gone down, and that was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, would be time for the Western West to go down. I mean, we are similar societies, one run on Adam Smith and one run on Karl Marx at the time, you know, and the whole West is now falling. That's a completely different thing from when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was falling. But that, you know, dialectically speaking, out of the catastrophe can come something positive. And that's what I hope to see while I'm walking around here. But I can say, honestly, if I was 40 years younger, I would think of moving out of Europe. I don't know, don't ask me to where, but I would think of moving out of Europe. It doesn't look good to me, and I'm very scared on behalf of my children and my grandchildren. I must honestly say that. It sounds pathetic, but I'm going to say it anyhow.